Hey everybody, welcome to this cultural moment in Melbourne, Australia. Oh, that's fantastic. That's so not Melbourne. Portland is the same. If you get like a double chin nod, you know people are really excited. Like, the cooler you are, the less excited you are about anything. So, thank you so much for coming tonight. For those of you listening online, we're not in the basement of First Baptist.
No.
We're not even in Portland. We're in Melbourne. I got out of winter and rain and dark and cold and miserable. And right now it's hot and sweaty and beautiful and wonderful. And I love your city. It is, this is my second time here. And I think I'm more in love with it this time even than last. I was at the Botanical Gardens yesterday. Oh my gosh, have you been there? Is it like a tourist thing? Do you go there? It was fantastic. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm really looking forward to tonight. One, just because people from Red have been praying and fasting for a week straight as we move into tonight. So I just can't wait to see where our conversation goes, and thanks so much for coming. Mark, it's been about a year, I think, since you and I sat down, at least with the microphone in the room. So maybe just to kick things off, from kind of 30,000 feet across the West, or is that even the best way to think about it anymore? What do you see kind of happening? This is like my favorite moment is like Mark Sayers reads the news, basically. So help me interpret the world as usual. What do you see happening kind of the last 6, 12 months, broad strokes, brush strokes across the world?
Yeah, well, it's been really interesting because, in a sense, I think we're almost planning to do more, like before this, but there's just a bunch of stuff going on. You've released a book, I released a book. The last episode we did was in a field.
Yeah.
Now, I got this wrong. I either said it was Sussex and it was Surrey, or it's Surrey or Sussex, which in the medieval times they would declare a war on you for getting that wrong. But we're in England, and that was in May. Yes. And, I feel like there's this rapid acceleration of what's happening in the world. And I think that one of the real topics I think have been in this podcast is, there's a new sort of culture emerging we felt in the West, which was this sort of post-Christian culture. And a lot of, I guess, our first episodes are around what is post-Christian culture and a lot of the resonance that a lot of people have had with what we're doing.
And just give me your 1 or 2 sentence recap of post-Christian culture as opposed to pre or Christian culture. Like, just in a sentence or two, what is post-Christian culture?
Well, essentially, I think sometimes post-Christian culture has been spoken about as this blank slate that comes after Christianity. But really, post-Christian culture is an attempt to advance the goals of Christianity without Christ. Oh, as the line goes now, made famous by this podcast, the kingdom without the king.
Right.
Yeah, so we, I guess, have been wrestling with that, and in many ways, heaps of people in the church have been looking at, this resource of this podcast to help them grapple with that.
Because it's reactionary. So,
Yes.
I like to think of post-Christianity as like the rebellious teenager moment, like you're living in mom and dad's house, eating all of their food and living off of their dime while tweeting against them or whatever.
Yes.
And in a sense, many of us are living in the ethical house, so to speak, of a Christendom kind of Western world, but there's this reactionary moment against Christ and the way of Jesus, which is why it's great to talk about Buddhist mindfulness, even though on many issues of sexuality it's the exact same ethic, but you can't talk about Christian or Christian sexuality.
Yes.
So there's this reaction, this hostility that a lot of us feel at our workplace, not my workplace, I work at a church, but well, actually I feel it sometimes at my workplace, but we feel on the streets and with our lovely secular neighbors, there's this sense of walking on eggshells, you know what I mean? So I think kind of naming that felt experience and the kind of, we haven't moved beyond Christianity, there's this reactionary moment against it. So keep going.
Yeah. So, and I think because of that felt hostility, there was a lot of people who sort of almost bought, and I was like this for a few years, this is the future.
Yes.
It's going to be against this,
everything's going to secularize.
Totally. And the illustration I would use is around tennis balls, which you knew I was going there.
Exactly what I was thinking.
Exactly. So imagine if there was a floor and on it you placed a tennis ball. And let's imagine that's the period where the church was the dominant thing in the West, or Christianity was the dominant thing in the West. And then there's this period in Western history where next to it there's this other tennis ball. And perhaps this one's green and perhaps that one's yellow. And the other tennis ball is this post-Christian opening in the West, which begins with things like the Renaissance and grows into the Enlightenment, the modern period. And we realized that there were these two options in the West.
Yeah.
But then I feel
and this
like
is really across. If you're in Germany or America
Yes.
or New Zealand or Oz, like across the kind of Western world, there were these two kind of side-by-side currents.
yes. And then I feel like what happened a few years ago is there was a sense of increased hostility and something seemed to advance. And so in my incredible illustration about tennis balls, it's like the yellow tennis ball representing...
Somebody tells me this is not going to be Mark Sayers at his best, right?
No, it's yeah.
Sports analogies just break down.
Yes, we can edit this, by the way. And imagine then if the yellow tennis ball, which is like representing post-Christianity, all of a sudden was replaced by a basketball. So the church then looks up and it's not an equal footing. It's this massive thing
Right.
overtowering it. And I feel like the last few
And
years
it's
has been
scary
that. It's
at
scary.
that point,
It's
yeah.
like, hang on.
We're
It was sort of
doomed.
it's equal footing and now it's against us. Like before, like, oh, hang on, we had these religious freedoms, but what if that's in danger now? Or at church now, at work now, instead of just seeing me as some sort of Christian dork who's a bit, has some weird taste in music, now you're a problem.
Yes.
And I reckon that's sort of where we've been in this podcast a little bit, looking at that. What does that mean? The emergence of that
What does it look like to be a religious minority?
in that space. And I feel like what's changed, and I don't know if it's that I've become more attuned to it, I think it's that. In the last 6 months, as I've thought about this, is what I think is happening in the world is post-Christianity is being disrupted. Now, post-Christianity becoming the basketball, in a sense, you're then holding the fort. You actually have to hold power.
Yes.
In the past, the church was holding power, and you had, people like Voltaire, who, French intellectuals who were like the rebels, the heretics.
Yeah.
And then all
What's
of a sudden,
the Foucault line? Where there is power, there is resistance.
yes, exactly.
But what happens when the resistance is now in power?
Yes. And is that a Star Wars reference?
No, that's a French philosophy reference.
Oh,
I'm
true.
trying to
Sorry.
be smart like you.
Sorry.
It just doesn't work. The moment nobody takes me seriously.
Is that The Last Jedi? And,
Star Wars is being disrupted. That's a whole
It's-
other
oh, yeah.
podcast.
Yes,
Oh my
yes.
goodness.
So what actually is happening is post-Christianity is being disrupted. And it's being disrupted. And my illustration is then what happens. So you've got these two balls, and the church is looking at this giant post-Christian ball and freaking out. And then what is happening is someone's gone into the back storeroom of the physical education department and brought just like huge bags of basketballs, footballs, hockey balls, golf balls, and just
Dodgeball.
everything.
Put that in.
Just dumped them, and now there's all these different balls on the floor. And for me, like, this is the disruption of post-Christianity by where we're heading, which is a truly globalization.
So name some of those other balls, the football, the soccer, the other stuff, the disruption.
Let me illustrate this way. So yesterday I was in Kuala Lumpur, and which is the capital of Malaysia. You go onto the main street, and it looks like the future. This is not the Malaysia that looked like when I went there when I was 16. All around me are moving billboards. They had this like crazy, massive mall that was just at the end of the street where we were at. You walk into it, and it's this gigantic, interactive, moving, singing Chinese New Year
Tokyo
meets
kind of
Tokyo
feel.
New Year meets Chinese New Year meets Disney. So gigantic mini, which was like a robot, Minnie and Mickey Chinese New Year robots that were like probably several stories high.
Oh my
and
God.
And it's just like moving
It's
like
Blade Runner or
it
something.
was
I don't
totally
even
felt,
know.
Blade Runner, like Gucci and Coach and all these luxury brands. And I look up and down this street, and I just stop to take this in. So you've got all that going on, and then you've got the people. So you literally have people walking past you. So you've got the usual population of Malays, Chinese, Indians. But then you've got Swedish backpackers. You've got Saudis. Saudi middle-class families are increasingly coming to KL during the hot Saudi summer. So all along the main street there, there's like all these like Lebanese food, Arabic food. You've got an increasing Nigerian population. But what I also noticed was not just the ethnic groups, but then all the different styles. You've got like Nigerian guys that sort of got like their hip hop gear on, and then they've also got other Nigerian guys that are wearing their like traditional African gear. You've got like super cool hipster like Chinese, tourists that have come over, and then you've got a very traditionally Islamic dressed sort of Malay person. And all of it in the one
All
place.
on the same street.
All on the same street. And what I realized is what's happening in the world is the West has talked about diversity a lot. It's been this value of the West. We have in Victoria, our state here, the government, that's one of their big values.
But it's a lot more about ethnic diversity than it is about actual religious diversity or
diversity
ideological
of thought.
diversity. Yeah, diversity of thought.
And so what's actually happening is, in a place like Malaysia, we traditionally thought of places like Asia as, they're a bit behind the West. Now, I was in Newport Beach, which you probably know, in California. And what was interesting, being in Newport Beach, people say it's a nice part of Orange County. But it's so interesting. You go to Newport Beach and you look around, you go to the mall, and it's sort of like, it feels a bit run down. You feel that building's been there since the 90s. And what's bizarre now is you can go to some cities in Britain, some cities in America, and then you go to Asia, and Asia now looks like the future. And I don't think the West has been prepared for this. And so I think what's actually happening is we're moving from globalization that's been primarily led by the West to now this incredible global network.
True globalization.
True globalization.
Where it's no longer binary. It's no longer the two options in the West. It's multipolar, and there's people from all over the world.
And if you walked around Melbourne here, what I began to realize, I used to have this thought like, Melbourne's this progressive city, everyone's out there, that's my mission field, how do I reach that? But now I just have conversations with people, and you can meet such a wide variety of different people in the street that what we have to change our mentality is actually, we're no longer how do we reach the culture, we're filled by cultures.
Yeah.
Now, culture is a word that actually comes from cultus, and cultus is Latin for worship. It's also linked to agriculture. And so Christopher Dawson, who is a Catholic intellectual in the mid-century, said that cultures are built around ultimately by what they worship. And in the world, people worship many, many different things. And the reason we've had this sort of...
And that doesn't have to be an overt spiritual kind of worship of a god or a goddess. It could just be whatever you ascribe ultimate value to. It could be freedom. It could be sexuality, right? Like one of the things we've realized in our city is sex isn't about sex. It's about worship. It's a soteriology. It's a doctrine of salvation for so many people. Totally. You're saying it could be anything from sex to God to Krishna to anything.
To a Ferrari.
A culture is built around what it is that you worship as a people.
And see, the West, for most of its time, particularly through much of our lives time and the generations before, existed in an industrial age. An industrial age created like one culture. So if we talk about culture from the mid part of the 20th century till recently, we talked about mass culture. So,
because industrialization was really about like how do you make things for the masses, right?
Exactly.
How do you make people similar to sell more things to them?
And Henry Ford, made millions and millions of dollars by producing the T model Ford.
Our education system was built on that same,
exactly.
Right?
And you even had TV networks. In the US, you had, like one TV, I think 3 or 4 TV networks. In Australia, we had, a similar thing. And what that meant was you could reach the public with one message. And you thought of the American public, the Australian public. And in some senses, the church bought into that. Yeah. And so governments and institutions could control the public by giving them one message. Governments had control by controlling entertainment or government messaging through actually communicating this message. And what they would do is they try and work out what the public wants. So they'd have like focus groups.
Right.
But what's changing is we live at a time where actually information is expanding exponentially. And we have at our fingertips more information than people have ever had in their history. In our phones just here, could have run an entire country 100 years ago. And what that's meant is that no longer is there this public, there's actually all these different publics.
Plural.
So I think as a church, I think the big idea what this season is going to be about as we wrestle through this is that don't think of the church and then the culture, the church and what my unchurched friends think, the church and what the American public thinks. Where we're actually at is we're in a network. And there are all these different balls, and just imagine my sport ball analogy, that actually in between them, then there's strings moving. And that means there's connection. So when we have, at the moment, we're in this coronavirus thing, and it's far away in China, in Wuhan province, but then in Box Hill, just one, couple of kilometers here.
Suburb, right by
There's
here.
literally businesses going out of business because the world is so interconnected now.
Yeah, I think we had booked me a hotel there or something. And had
Yeah,
to
we
shut
were
it
like,
down, right.
we had this, so John Mark was coming out, and we were like, let's put him, this was before last year, let's put him somewhere nice near the beach. Then we had all these bushfires, so like, how do we do that? And then we're going to put him in a hotel in Box Hill, and we had to deal with the coronavirus.
I'm just happy it's not raining ash this week.
Exactly,
Or whatever.
yeah, the toxic smoke's
Happy
gone
for
away.
that.
So there's this sense where I think as the church, the fundamental playground.
But that's an interesting thing, because that's not just the transmission of ideas
Yes.
through the digital sphere. That's the transmission, in that case, of a disease through people
Exactly.
on airplanes.
Yes.
So the world keeps getting smaller
Yes.
as it is getting bigger.
So the world's then getting into all these different smaller groupings. So we're all talking to each other at the same time. And what this means as the church is no longer then are you this smaller tennis ball and this giant basketball's like, you know, you're in its shadow and you're afraid.
I see the cartoon of like the mean basketball
Yes.
about to kill the poor tennis ball. That was like, we used to run this thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
and now what it is we are one ball amongst all of these different spaces. Wow. And I think we're just getting our heads around this. And this is actually going to fully upend the Western order. I mean, like, really interesting thing. So just an example.
Because the Western order is going to become increasingly meaningless.
Yes. Because what the West was built on an idea that there was universal human rights. There were inalienable rights that every human being could ascribe to. Now, this is actually something that
Which was built off of Imago Dei theology, Genesis
Exactly.
chapter 1.
Everyone's got it. So they then were run in Western countries. But then the West went through this period where let's put that in an international system. So after World War II, the US and Britain, primarily the US later in the half of the century, built this international order where it controlled human rights, it controlled economies, it controlled everything. But what we're living through is the complete change. All of a sudden you've got India rising, you've got China rising, and all of a sudden there's multiple players in the room.
And the secular world no longer has like a very coherent philosophical reasoning for human rights, which
Yes.
seems like, I've actually read some experts saying we're in a crisis of human rights right now,
Yes.
because without the biblical or Judeo-Christian, like, human beings are created in the image of God, therefore we can't gas people we don't like in a chamber. Once you don't have that anymore, who are we in the West? Some have called it Western supremacy, not white
Yes.
supremacy, but Western supremacy.
Yes.
When we come into Uganda or whatever and advocate for rights around sexuality or whatever, and people push back and say, who are you to tell us? And if we don't have a coherent philosophical, I'm not saying I disagree with that, I'm just saying, it leaves the West open to charges of imperialism.
And what it means is everything's under pressure. Like, I think what has to change is that the church saw itself under pressure, but now everything's under pressure. And one of the interesting, just one example is the NBA has defined itself in the American sporting landscape as the more sort of progressive sporting body.
Right.
The NFL actually promote itself as more the American.
Yeah.
Said Colin Kaepernick.
And basketball started in urban centers.
Exactly.
And, yeah.
And so had like the whole Colin Kaepernick thing where he kneeled to the national anthem and this thing, and it's this whole culture war thing in America. And so the NBA has been pushing this,
But less so in basketball, because it's,
Yes.
you're saying basketball fans are more open to that view of the world.
I think that's what the NBA's tried to pursue that.
Yes.
But then you have this interesting thing. So then you have the general manager, I think it was, of the Houston Rockets, who during the Hong Kong protests then puts up a pro-Hong Kong tweet. Now, the NBA has been pushing, we're about tolerance and diversity and human rights.
And this is pro-human rights and democracy in Hong Kong.
And then what happens is, all of a sudden, the NBA completely comes down on the general manager of the Houston Rockets. Now, the history of the Houston Rockets in China is that Yao Ming, who's like one of the best Chinese basketballer, he played for Houston Rockets. It's the most popular team in China.
I don't know anything about basketball, so he's a Chinese
guy, came across,
citizen, came over, plays basketball for the
and also
Rockets.
because Chinese colours of yellow and red, Houston Rockets, so it became this huge team.
And that's just a coincidence, the yellow and red.
Yeah, well, it all worked together.
Yeah.
And then China becomes the NBA's biggest market in the last few years. But what was so fascinating is how quickly it flipped. So the NBA then pushes back on, this manager.
Because they're scared they're going to lose all of their revenue stream from China.
Yes.
If you're pro-democracy in Hong Kong. Which is pro-human rights, which is what they stand for.
Yes.
Until it costs money.
And then literally you've got Chinese fans burning Houston Rockets jerseys. The Houston Rocket logo disappears off the Chinese NBA website. Chinese TV stops broadcasting.
Because they can do that. They can just go into the website
shut it all down.
and
So
shut it down.
Houston Rockets got unpersoned. Like they don't exist anymore.
Oh my gosh.
And
That's
what
a
is so?
thing.
You give that example. So there was also an English Premier League one where a Turkish. German player of Turkish descent, Mesut Ozil, he basically tweeted a support of the Uyghur people, which is a Turkic minority in Western China. And same thing happened. Arsenal, were forced, one of the biggest clubs in England, very popular in Asia. So all of a sudden, these clubs, like in the English Premier League, which has pushed itself into, we're a diverse organisation, tolerant organisation, the NBA, these brands, what that is they were engaged in the Western culture war, if you like. And then all of a sudden, it's like they're completely outmaneuvered by Chinese culture war is
and
coming.
you have two totally different viewpoints at that point in constituencies.
So you've got a Chinese cultural struggle over, are the Hong Kong protesters legitimate? You've got this battle going on between, with China and Hong Kong, and you've got difference of opinion in both places. And then you've got these two culture wars smashing into each other. And then so you've got, NBA players who have been very, vocal on human rights issues being asked questions around human rights in amongst the Uyghur people or in Hong Kong, and NBA reporters shutting them down.
And the Uyghur people in China are...
Sorry, they're a Muslim Turkic minority.
Muslim Turkish minority.
Yes.
Who are being persecuted right now. They're in the internment camps, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Estimates by the UN of up to 1 million there. And it's so fascinating because this is the West, which is always thought of as the main show in the world.
Right.
And particularly America has seen itself as, well, who cares what happens, outside. And, for years the joke that, there's very little international news. But here is a foreign country fundamentally changing the cultural script within a country. So what the future is, that's not a one-off. That's just going to happen more and more.
That's the first of many.
So, in this series, what we're going to do is we're going to look a lot more about what it means that we've switched from this binary thing between sort of Christian and post-Christian. What does it look like when we're actually then going to this network? And so we're going to dig into a lot of the implications of that. But I wanted to bring it back to the Christian story.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, the whole dynamic of when Christianity is the sole thing in charge, you don't find an example of that in the Bible. When Christianity is this one sort of thing next to this dominant other thing, we can make these things like, is that Christianity and the Roman Empire? But when you actually look at the letters of Paul, when you actually look what he's writing about, the reality of a city like Corinth or Ephesus or Antioch, what you've actually got is the Roman Empire as a network.
Yeah.
And you've got the whole of this empire went across from Britain into North Africa, into Turkey today, almost into Central Asia. And it was a giant, multicultural, diverse empire. And what connected it together was Roman roads.
Transportation.
What connected was aqueducts. They learned to take water.
And then the system.
Roman language, Latin. And also Roman postal system.
Yeah.
And so Paul, you look at Paul could not have existed without a network. If Paul had come 500 years later, he wouldn't even be able to do what he did. Paul used the Roman letters. You think of our Bible and a lot of the New Testament is Paul using the information superhighway of the Roman world. His travels, I'm coming to visit you, or sending Timothy over here, that's him using the network. And so what I think is actually happening is we need to move from, I think, an unhealthy fear that the church has had in the West of, we're out of power.
Yeah.
And
how do we just survive
the
end of Western civilization?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm actually at a point where I'm actually getting really hopeful. And I'm looking at the new arrangement in the West, and it's like mass disruption everywhere. And there's positive disruptions, there's negative disruptions, everything's under pressure.
But am I right? Some of the strongest followers of Jesus in the world right now as we speak are coming out of Asia.
Well, I just was, and again too, we want to look at this later on in this podcast, but the reason I was in Kuala Lumpur was for some release of some Barna. Barna is a company that's a Christian demographics company, and they just released data. We did a series on it here at Red of looking at the faith lives of millennials from 25 countries across the world. They broke this into 4 categories. They said those who at some stage, born Christian or became Christian in the millennial age group, 20 to 35, that there were 4 groupings. Number one was those who had left the church, like they had left their faith, like I'm not a Christian anymore. There was another group who were basically, I sort of believe, but I'm just not in church.
I think they called them nomads, right? That group.
Yeah. There was another group which were habitual Christians. These like cultural Christians who go, their backsides are in a pew,
once in a while at least, but no
but
big difference.
they don't really have biblical lives. But then there was this last group, and the last group was the resilient disciples. These are people whose lives are biblical. They actually are living the stuff. And what I found
They're thriving, and I think they called it Digital Babylon was their name.
Thriving in Digital Babylon, and we'll do a whole podcast on that. But what I found so interesting is the pressure of this new cultural dynamic is actually making them better Christians. And I think that is such a fundamental paradigm shift for so much of a church focus, which is actually how do we make the best service for you with the best parking, with like this seamless thing that'll finish at that minute, and your kids will be delivered to you washed and cleaned. No one's done that yet. And it's
Quoting
this like
Shakespeare, all the things,
exactly. And so but actually when you think about it, pressure is actually always positive for the people of God. I'm not saying it's actually good, but pressure and difficulty has always, been something which the church has thrived on. So the breakdown. So in the US, you have 10% of millennials who are actually resilient disciples.
And those aren't just of millennials in general. Those are millennials who were born Christian or came to faith, right?
Today,
And the 4 categories, post-Christian, nomad, habitual churchgoers, resilient disciples. Of Christian millennials, basically, 10% are resilient disciples, followers of Jesus.
In Australia, it's 8. But that's really interesting because in Australia, we think of America as this big church and it's huge.
It's not really that different.
It's the actual amount of people doing it.
And that stat for America, that isn't Portland or that's America as a whole.
Yes. But what's interesting, you think so many of our resources, so many of our worship albums, so many of our colleges, so many of our big speakers, where do they all come from? America, there's a fair few Aussies in there.
Yeah.
But Malaysia, I think it's 24% resilient disciples.
More than double.
Yes, and it's like, hang on, there's something happening because there is a cultural pressure from a government. There's this multi-faith environment, and that's the new reality in which we're all going to.
So in an America or an Oz, there are less people following Jesus, but those who are actually more rigorous in their pursuit of Jesus.
Yes.
And then coming in Asia, which is now globalization, coming to our country to yours, way more mashup. We have less and less influence as Westerners. There's actually a much higher percentage of resilient disciples and followers.
Yes. The highest percentage was actually in Kenya. I can't remember the exact figure. We'll do an episode where we dig into the data. But I think what's that saying is there's this tremendous moment of hope.
Yeah.
And what I realized
So we need to stop thinking about there's just these 2 stories, Christianity, which is a dying story, post-Christian, secular, progressive culture, which is on the rise and will eventually dominate the world. That's not actually a map of the future.
No.
And you're seeing that breakdown across the world. It's much more multipolar and different perspectives and religions and backgrounds and ethnic histories and political ideologies and a whole new world with a whole new complexity. And in that, there's actually some really beautiful things. There's a chance for the gospel to travel across the world, and even for us in the West to learn from many in Asia as it's emerging and their really rigorous pursuit of Jesus.
So I think like almost what I feel is a little bit chastened, I think, because I think we started this conversation, and we'd often say in the West, and hey, we're in Portland and Melbourne, where are these progressive Western cities? But I think where I sit now is the experience I had in KL a few days ago, where I was there and I saw all those different cultures. It's a hub. Kuala Lumpur is a hub for Southeast Asia, and modernity is increasingly looking more like Asia than us. But also, here's 24% resilient disciples. There are many Iranians who are coming to faith as refugees in Kuala Lumpur. There are people who are finding the gospel in a place like that, and then it's just going out to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. I spent.
What's the story we just heard about of Kenyan Christians running Alpha in Mandarin in Kenya, and all sorts of people coming to faith.
So, just to explain that.
That's the future.
That's the future. So basically, Donald Trump's thing is, do you see the pause there?
Do we have to talk about this?
I'll just go. Donald Trump's vision, very much, is make America great again and build a wall. And But it's interesting, when you think about that, what that is it's a vision of, let's put a barrier around it.
Right.
Now, there's other people too. Let's have this European Union type vision where, we're all going from, London to Paris and New York, and, we can just use the same Uber app, and it's sort of this ultra rich, you can just easily move below the places.
Right.
So I don't want to make that dichotomy as much. But I think where we are heading it's interesting, the age we're in, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, his vision is Belt and Road, which is actually this network across the world.
Yeah, what is Belt and Road?
Belt and Road is, China sees itself as the Middle Kingdom. That's how it's always seen itself. And if you go back to the medieval period, we often think of knights and chivalry and castles, but really the medieval period was a period, and before then, when there was this incredible network that spread across the world, a lot of it from Asia along the Silk Roads, and it was this almost lattice of just these different connections, sea lanes. There were Jewish people in India, in Kerala, that actually in India, Indian Christians in Kerala actually still speak some Aramaic in their liturgy. There were travelers coming across. There was, in South Africa, there are Cape Malay, who are basically Malay people who then migrated to.
Yes, I've been there, yeah.
It's just all this incredible connection in the world. And so Belt and Road is China's vision, but I think what they're doing is jumping on a dynamic that's already happening in the world. That we're moving from, imagine like these two binaries were against each other, to now this new world where everything's connected. And it's
So don't try to build a wall is China's philosophy. Rather control the network, control the road.
Yes,
which is
don't
why they're
build a wall,
buying and
build the
building
roads.
ports around the world. And
well, I mean, there's a project. I don't know if it's how it's like. There's literally, you can get a train from Beijing to Moscow. I think there's one now to Delhi. There's talk of a train from Beijing to Seattle.
I feel like I need some architecture lessons there, engineering help.
Well,
with
it's
that
going
one.
through Siberia, underneath Alaska, coming out and joining the Seattle network. So it's this network going across the world, and this is going to fundamentally change the world. You can only have a Western post-Christian order when you're in control. But a network actually undermines it.
And it opens up all sorts of new possibilities.
So that story, so basically what's happened with Belt and Road, China's then built this sea lanes to Kenya, and there's been 1 million Chinese people move to Africa, which is fascinating. Mandarin's becoming one of the fastest growing languages in Africa. And so what's happening is, in Kenya, there are churches where all of a sudden these Belt and Road workers, because Chinese companies often in Africa will use their own workers and they ship them across. So here you've got these people raised in an atheistic environment under an atheistic government in China who then come to Kenya and are working on these projects and find their way into Kenyan churches.
With thriving churches all over the place.
So what's happening is Alpha is getting requests for Alpha, which is an evangelistic program, to actually be sent to Africa in Mandarin. So there's like Kenyans going, can you send us Mandarin Alpha? And so there's all these Chinese becoming Christians in the Kenyan church. So the Kenyans, so we often think, like Kenyans coming to the West or something. So Kenyans are now like, how do we do cross-cultural ministry to mainland Chinese people?
In Kenya.
In Kenya. And this is just one story that's happening across the world.
This is the future.
And this undermines this Western story because I think, modernity is less and less in the West. That secondly, the West is at a moment where in some ways we're being humbled. You look at what's happened with political polarization. Like I think the question people often ask us, they send in emails like, man, what's happening with the political polarization in America or Brexit? And part of that is the West is being humbled. And the West is actually brought into this place of humility.
And there's no sign of it stopping anytime soon.
No sign of it stopping too. I think the network is disrupting everything. And we can talk about, the Donald Trump thing. So much of that, or Brexit, is because the supply chain's changed. And industry then is now shipped to China or Vietnam or Bangladesh. So I see this incredible possibility for the gospel at this moment. And what if the next renewal is actually not just one that happens in the Hebrides or in this part of Ireland or in that small part of India?
What if it's in Kenya?
What if it's in the network? What if the network
everywhere?
goes viral? And what if it's not just people and information and money flowing through the network? What if the next thing is the Holy Spirit and the presence?
Okay, push pause. We'll come back. We'll continue this conversation. Thanks, Mark. That was less than boring.